We are painted a picture of the past, where our ancestors lived for millennia in a state of primitive backwardness, slowly and painfully moving toward the heights of modern civilization. But what if this picture is merely a convenient fiction, hiding the truth about highly advanced civilizations of the past? What if they possess technology comparable to the late 19th or even early 20th century, only for their world to be destroyed and forgotten? This idea might seem fantastic, but only until we consider that human history is not a straight line. According to this concept, civilization repeatedly reached a high level of development, only to be thrown back by global catastrophes, devastating floods, and destructive wars. Yet each time, humanity, preserving fragments of knowledge, rebuilt its industries and technologies with astonishing speed, rising again from the ruins. This cycle repeated, but each new chapter began with the memory of the last one erased. To see the inconsistencies, you don't need to delve into complex scientific research. You only need to look at something that was once in everyone's hands: money, and the timeline upon which our entire history is based. There are ancient nautical charts of astonishing accuracy. On them, we see dates like 740 or 750. They are written simply, with no additional symbols at the beginning. However, when we turn to coins from the same period, the picture changes. A mysterious symbol J, or the number 1, appears before the year. Thus, the date J750 easily becomes the familiar 1750. A logical question arises. Why were dates on different forms of media, created in the same era, written in different styles? Which is the mistake, or the deliberate forgery? The maps where the millennium is missing, or the coins where it is added? This seemingly minor fact undermines the very foundations of our calendar. The entire basis of modern chronology is the birth of Christ. But what if that date was also determined incorrectly? Some research suggests this event occurred not 2,000 years ago, but in the year 1152. If this is true, then only about 873 years have passed since the birth of Christ to the present day, not more than 2,000. This means that an entire millennium was artificially added to official history, 1,000 years filled with phantom events and rulers. This revelation calls into question the dating of entire eras. It means that coins cataloged today as 1st century BC might actually belong to the 1050s, and the 6th century AD could be as recent as the 1750s. Rulers and events could be moved around like pieces on a chessboard to fit a timeline that historians found most suitable. The dates are often absent on the coins themselves. They are determined by the ruler depicted, and his place in history has long been legitimized by official science. But where can we find the key to solving this grand puzzle? Perhaps the answer lies not in the capital's archives, but in places where official science prefers not to look. In the very heart of lands considered wild and untamed. It is there, far from the centers of power, that we find artifacts that don't just question, but completely shatter the established view of the world. This fundamental inconsistency in dating is not just a random error or a craftsman's whim. It is a systemic fracture running through the very fabric of history. Imagine a skilled cartographer whose life is dedicated to precision, and an expert mint master responsible for the state's currency standard. Would these people in the very same era use two completely different methods of writing the year? It's as illogical as if today, some documents were dated 2025 while others were simply dated 25, leaving future generations to guess which century was meant. A 1,000-year difference is not a margin of error, it's a chasm. This suggests one of two things. Either one of the dating systems was intentionally distorted, or we are completely misinterpreting the signs left by our ancestors. The symbol before the date on coins, often the letter I or J, was later interpreted as the number 1. This simple assumption may have been what artificially lengthened our history by a full millennium. What if it wasn't a number, but a marker for an era, or some other symbol whose meaning has been lost or deliberately changed? If you remove this supposed 1, the dates on maps and coins align perfectly. And at that moment, the entire official timeline built on this shaky foundation begins to crumble. This chronological shift becomes even more apparent when we turn to the central event of our calendar. According to alternative research, the key figure of Christianity was born not in the year 0, but in 1152. This conclusion changes everything. It means that from that event to the present day, no more than 873 years have passed. So where did the other 11.5 centuries go? They were simply written in, creating a vast historical layer filled with phantom events, dark ages, and reigns that were either copied from later eras or invented entirely. This theory explains many oddities, such as the history of the Christianization of Rus. The official story says that Prince Vladimir chose the Greek religion, which permitted the drinking of wine. But if you look closer, the description of this faith strikingly resembles the cult of Dionysus, the ancient Greek god of wine. A son of a god, immaculately conceived, born on December 25th, a wandering teacher who performed miracles and turned water into wine. Many researchers call this cult an early form of Christianity, or a transitional phase from paganism. Perhaps this is what our ancestors adopted, and only much later, as part of a global rewriting of history, was this event tied to a new, artificially aged timeline. If our timeline is wrong, it invalidates the entire system for dating artifacts. Imagine a coin with a ruler's image. It doesn't say minted in the 5th century AD. The date is determined by the identity of the monarch. But who determined when that monarch lived? Historians who relied on the very chronology that is now in doubt. It's a vicious circle. Rulers and entire dynasties could be moved through time like chess pieces to fill the artificial voids in history. Scythian coins, now called the ancestors of Russian money, may be much closer to our time than we are led to believe. All of official history becomes a grand construct, where every element is tailored to a predetermined narrative. But if the central archives and accepted works are part of this illusion, where can we find genuine proof? The answer is simple: where the creators of this illusion couldn't reach. The true traces of a hidden history lie not in capital city museums, but in remote lands considered to be the periphery. It is there, in the wilderness that historians have called ahistorical, that we find facts so inexplicable from the standpoint of official science that they have the power to destroy the entire world they have built. Leaving aside the shaky timeline, we move to the 18th century and turn our gaze eastward to lands that official history describes as a harsh, wild, and nearly uninhabited frontier. The Siberia of that time is depicted as endless expanses of impassable taiga, a complete lack of roads, and sparse settlements separated by hundreds of miles. The empire's capital, the brilliant St. Petersburg, is thousands of kilometers away, and communication with these lands, we are told, was extremely difficult. Any journey became a perilous expedition, and governance over these territories was nominal at best. And against this backdrop of absolute isolation from civilization, a fact emerges that not only defies logic, but completely shatters it. It was here, in the very heart of this supposed wilderness, that the empire's key industrial centers were located, its main mints. From 1725 in Yekaterinburg, and later from 1766 in Suzun, in what is now the Novosibirsk region, the bulk of the country's copper currency was minted. These were not small temporary workshops. They were industrial giants of their time, supplying a vast empire with money for decades. Let's pause for a moment and try to comprehend this paradox from a common sense perspective. Any centralized state, especially an empire, seeks to maintain the strictest control over the issuance of money. It is the foundation of its financial stability and power. Placing a mint in the capital or its immediate vicinity is an axiom of governance. It allows for strict accounting, swift delivery of new dies when a ruler changes, and most importantly, it prevents fraud. Now imagine a mint in Suzun, over 3,000 kilometers from the capital in a straight line. With no roads or fast communication, who could possibly control how many coins were actually being minted in this remote location? Any local official would face the colossal temptation to run the press for his own benefit, flooding the country with unaccounted-for money. It would be a perfect recipe for economic chaos, and any sane government would have avoided such a risk at all costs. The second baffling question is logistics. Let's assume the coins were minted under strict, though inexplicably managed control. Now they needed to be delivered to users across the country. We are talking about tons, hundreds of tons of copper in the form of finished coins. Their journey lay westward, to the Urals and the European part of Russia. To get there, the convoys of money had to cross major rivers, the Ob, the Irtysh, the Volga, not to mention countless smaller ones. There were no bridges, we are told. This meant crossing on rafts or boats in the summer and over the ice in winter. Each method was fraught with immense risk. A boat could capsize, a wagon could fall through the ice or be caught in a blizzard in the endless steppe. And then there was another factor: bandits. A transport of raw copper to the mint would be of little interest to them, but a convoy of finished money was the dream of any gang. Every such shipment would have required a massive military escort, making the logistics incredibly expensive and complex. Wouldn't it have been simpler and safer to transport the raw material, the copper, to the capital and mint the coins there, in the center of power? Official history offers no answer to this simple question. Crowning this picture of absurdity is the problem of communication. Imagine an order needing to be sent from St. Petersburg to Suzun to change the minting volume, or to deliver new dies with the portrait of a new monarch. At a travel speed of 15 kilometers a day, without accounting for weekends, rivers, and muddy seasons, a one-way trip would take 213 days. In practice, a round trip would take almost a year. How could anyone effectively manage production under such conditions? Any decision from the capital would reach the executors with a monstrous delay, by which time it might have lost all relevance. The mint would have been operating almost completely blind, in a total information vacuum. The existence of these industrial centers under the conditions described by official history seems not just strange, it seems utterly impossible. Logic suggests that either the mints weren't there, or the conditions were entirely different. Since the mints did exist, and the coins they produced are in museums, only the second option remains. We are not being lied to about the fact itself, but about the context. We are told of a wild, impassable Siberia to hide the truth about its real state at the time. What if they are lying to us not only about the chronology, but also about the level of technology and infrastructure of that era? Perhaps the answer to the Siberian paradox lies not in economics and governance, but in the realm of technology we believe belongs to a much later time. When logic based on the official version of history hits a dead end, there is only one path left: to assume that the version itself is wrong. The absurdity of giant mints operating in an impassable wilderness vanishes like smoke if we introduce one missing element: a developed transportation infrastructure. Not the kind our imagination paints, with wagons sinking in mud and frail boats battling river currents, but a real, efficient, and all-encompassing network capable of ensuring the swift and safe delivery of goods and people over vast distances. The only technology that could solve all the aforementioned problems, control, logistics, and communication, is the railroad. This hypothesis may seem shocking, as we have been taught since childhood that the railway era in Russia only began in the mid-19th century. But facts are stubborn things, and they demand an explanation. If we assume that a network of railways already existed in Siberia in the 18th century, all the pieces of the puzzle fall into place. The problem of controlling the mints disappears. With a rail link, officials and inspectors from the capital could reach Ekaterinburg or Suzun not in a year, but in a matter of days or weeks. Surprise audits and constant oversight would become a reality, completely eliminating the possibility of mass fraud. Communication would also cease to be a problem. Urgent orders, new coin dies, and reports could travel between the capital and Siberia with astonishing speed, ensuring the smooth operation of the entire imperial financial system. The logistics of money and raw materials would transform from a deadly venture into a routine operation. Heavy trains loaded with copper or finished coins could move safely and quickly along steel tracks, regardless of weather, rivers, or bandits. Guarding such a train would require far fewer resources than escorting hundreds of scattered carts. A railway is not just a path, it is a controlled corridor that is easy to defend. It is interesting to note that the West Siberian Railway, built in the mid-20th century, runs directly through Suzun. Perhaps modern engineers were simply laying a new track along an existing, more convenient route left by their distant predecessors. This theory sheds light not only on the mystery of the mints, it also explains the phenomenon of the Demidovs and other industrialists whose factories were scattered throughout the Urals, the Altai, and Siberia. Official history claims they transported their products, metal, cannons, weapons, by river. But one look at a map is enough to see the absurdity of this claim. Most Siberian rivers flow north, toward the Arctic Ocean. How in heaven's name could they have delivered cannons for a war with Sweden, which was being fought in the west on the Baltic Sea? It is physically impossible. The products would have had to be floated north and then somehow dragged thousands of kilometers overland to the west, against the current of other rivers. The only logical explanation is the existence of land-based transport arteries capable of moving multi-ton cargo. And once again, railways are the perfect fit for this role. If 18th century Siberia had a developed railway network, it fundamentally changes our perception of the region. Building and maintaining such an infrastructure requires colossal resources, advanced metallurgy, engineering knowledge, and, most importantly, a massive labor force. You don't build railways in a desert. They connect cities, industrial centers, and populated areas. Their existence would be irrefutable proof that Siberia in that era was not a wild frontier, but a densely populated, industrially developed, and strategically vital region of the empire. The German historian Gerhard Friedrich Müller, invited to Russia to write its history, once remarked, "Siberia is an ahistorical land." This mantra is still repeated today by thousands of his followers, who do not bother to seek evidence to the contrary. But if we accept the hypothesis of an advanced civilization, Müller's actions appear in a new light. It is known that during his travels, he did not so much study as he did confiscate and destroy local archives. Priceless books and scrolls were taken to an unknown location. Perhaps he was not a researcher, but a cleaner, whose task was to erase the memory of Siberia's true past and replace it with the myth of a wild land that civilization only began to tame with the arrival of the Romanovs. But can all traces be erased? Material evidence is much harder to destroy than paper documents. If a powerful civilization truly existed in Siberia, it must have left behind something more durable than rails that could be melted down and sleepers that could rot. There must be traces of its activities, visible even after centuries. And such traces exist. They are so vast and inexplicable that they baffle modern science, yet they fit perfectly into our new picture of the world. From a bird's-eye view, and even more so from space, the Siberian taiga appears in a completely unexpected light. The endless green sea, which seems chaotic and wild from the ground, is in fact covered with a gigantic, geometrically perfect grid. These are not paths or modern logging roads. These are lines, straight as an arrow, intersecting at perfect right angles to form squares a mile or two on each side. These lines, known as clearings or prosakas, cover vast territories, stretching for hundreds and thousands of kilometers. The most astonishing thing about them is not just their scale and precision, but their abnormal durability. If you cut a clearing in a forest today, it will be overgrown with young trees in a matter of years. Yet these Siberian clearings have existed for centuries, and for some reason, nature cannot reclaim them. They remain visible, like scars on the face of the planet, defying time and the laws of botany. This fact alone suggests they were created using some technology unknown to us today. Now let's consider what the creation of such a colossal network would entail. This is not the work of a few logging crews. This is a mega project, comparable in complexity and resource intensity to the construction of the Egyptian pyramids or the Great Wall of China. First, it would have required incredibly precise surveying tools and knowledge. To lay a perfectly straight line for hundreds of kilometers through forests, swamps, and hills, and then to intersect it with another such line at exactly 90 degrees is a task that presents a serious challenge even today, with laser levels, theodolites, and satellite navigation. Our ancestors, as history assures us, had only primitive tools. How then did they achieve such accuracy that the diagonals of these giant forest squares converge with minimal error? Modern builders often fail to maintain the geometry of a foundation for a simple house. Second, implementing such a project would have required the mobilization of a huge number of people. Not tens or hundreds, but hundreds of thousands of workers, engineers, and surveyors, provided with housing, food, and tools. Where could such a population have come from in a wild and sparsely populated Siberia? Official history claims that Siberia was constantly and painstakingly settled by relocating peasants and exiles. But to create such a grid, you wouldn't need to settle it. You would need to have a surplus population already there. This completely refutes the myth of these lands being uninhabited. Third, and most importantly, every megaproject has a purpose. Civilizations do not spend colossal resources for no reason. They build roads for trade and moving armies, erect cities for people to live in, and create irrigation systems for agriculture. So what was the purpose of drawing the taiga into squares? This question still has no answer within the framework of official science. But logic itself suggests that such projects are undertaken only when all pressing problems have already been solved. When cities have been founded, factories and roads have been built, food production is established, and institutes and hospitals are functioning. Only then, with a surplus of resources, people, technology, and money, can a civilization afford to implement projects whose purpose is not entirely clear to us today. These clearings are silent but irrefutable evidence. They tell us that in the past, a highly developed civilization existed in Siberia, at the peak of its power. This was a civilization that did not just survive in harsh conditions, but dominated nature, reshaping it according to its own plan. It possessed technologies and organizational capabilities that we can hardly imagine. In times of turmoil, war, or revolution, no one would waste resources on cutting giant clearings in the forest. This is a sign of a long period of peace, stability, and prosperity. But if this civilization was so powerful, where did it go? Why are there only these mysterious lines left on the Earth, while its memory has been erased from the pages of history? The answer, paradoxically, can be found in the same place, on the same land, if we look even more closely. Satellite images show that the perfect geometric grid is not continuous everywhere. In some places, it seems to be cut off, covered by strange geological formations that look like giant frozen tongues of mud or clay. It looks as if someone poured thick glue onto a sheet of graph paper which then hardened and hid part of the drawing underneath. These traces point to a catastrophic event that suddenly and brutally ended the life of this civilization, burying its cities, its roads, and perhaps its creators themselves. The perfect geometry of the Siberian clearings, which testifies to a high level of civilization, is interrupted by equally vast and eloquent traces of its destruction. A detailed study of satellite maps reveals that these giant squares are, in places, covered by frozen currents. These are geological formations that scientists call flood tongues. They look as if a colossal mass of water, clay, and sand came from the northeast, wiping away everything in its path, and then solidified, burying a part of the ancient landscape along with its perfect grid. It is noteworthy that these tongues are fertile lands today and are actively cultivated. This suggests that the flood, as it moved across the northern territories, stripped them of their fertile layer and deposited it here, further south. And between these fertile deposits, sections of the old forest, still marked with squares, have been preserved. But this is not the only trace of the catastrophe. Near these flood formations, and even on them, one can see even more sinister marks. A multitude of perfectly circular lakes. Their shape is so regular that it rules out a natural origin. They are strikingly reminiscent of craters from powerful explosions. Each such crater today is either a lake or a swamp, and there are hundreds, if not thousands of them. They cover huge territories, marking the places where cities, industrial facilities, or some other important centers of the destroyed civilization were likely located. By combining these facts with scattered historical evidence and artifacts, we can attempt to reconstruct the timeline of events that led to the end of this world. It is likely there were several blows, spread out over several centuries. The first blow apparently occurred in the 15th or 16th century. This was the catastrophic flood whose traces we see in the form of the tongues. It destroyed the powerful Mughal Empire in India and wiped out the civilization we know as Scythia, after which Russia began to form on its ruins. This flood is also supported by the research of Lomonosov, who wrote that in Europe, when digging wells, entire sheaves of grain and trees with intact leaves and nuts were found at great depths, indicating a sudden and rapid burial under a thick layer of sediment. After this catastrophe, life did not stop. The survivors began to rebuild what was lost. Siberia may have become depopulated, but not completely. In the 17th century, industrialists and their families returned to the Urals and Siberia. An era of revival began, reaching its peak in the 18th century. It was during this period, from 1725 to the 1830s, that an incredible surge of development occurred. Cities were built, factories were founded, and those very mints were opened in Yekaterinburg and Suzun. This period, which official history modestly calls an era of palace coups, may have in fact been a time of rapid technological progress, comparable to the mid-20th century. The country's population grew rapidly, and a developed Siberia was an integral part of it. However, this renaissance was cut short by a second, even more terrible blow. In the first half of the 19th century, roughly between the 1810s and 1840s, a global conflict erupted. Judging by the perfectly circular craters, this was no ordinary war. The nature of the destruction points to the use of weapons of colossal power, comparable to nuclear weapons. Perhaps it was a war with out-of-control colonies in Africa or Australia, which had also reached a high level of development. This conflict left behind a scorched earth in the literal sense of the word. Cities and industrial centers were destroyed, Siberia was once again depopulated, and technology was thrown far back. It is precisely after this second catastrophe that the history we know from textbooks begins. In the 19th century, another setback occurs, and Siberia begins to be settled again, for the second time. Other continents were settled twice in a similar way. Australia was first developed by the Dutch, and after some cataclysm, the English arrived. North America suffered the same fate. The world as we know it began to form only from the mid-19th century, on the ruins of a previous, much more advanced civilization. The memory of this was erased. History was rewritten by the victors, or by those who came to the empty lands. The myth of a wild Siberia became a convenient cover story, explaining the absence of ancient history in the region. The first settlers of the 19th century found traces of their predecessors. In the early 18th century, the trade of bugrovshiks, people who excavated old burial mounds and extracted huge quantities of gold items known today as Scythian gold, flourished in Siberia. The famous Siberian collection of Peter the Great, housed in the Hermitage, was assembled from these very finds. This proves that even after the first flood, the land held the untold treasures of a lost civilization. Thus, all our official history is just a short final act in a long play. We are told of slow and steady progress, but in reality, we are the descendants of survivors of a global catastrophe, rebuilding a world on ruins and fragments without a full understanding of our true past. Artifacts such as coins with mysterious dates, inexplicable industrial facilities in the deep taiga, and scars on the body of the planet are the keys that allow us to lift the veil on this great secret. And so, having journeyed through the ruins of forgotten civilizations and the traces of wars that wiped them from the face of the earth, we return to where our investigation began, to a small metal disc, an ancient coin. At first, it seemed like just an annoying anomaly, a minor inconsistency in the smooth narrative of official history. But now, in light of the facts we've uncovered, it appears in a completely different light. This artifact is not a mistake or an accident. It is a key sticking out of a keyhole, behind which lies a completely different world, a different reality of our past. We now understand that the historians who dated these coins and entire eras may not have simply been mistaken. They may have been part of a system that consciously or unconsciously fitted any facts into a pre-existing, pre-approved paradigm. The main and most difficult question arises: why? Why has this grand and fascinating picture of the past been hidden from us behind a screen of primitive myths about bast shoes and thatched roofs? The answer lies not in the realm of science, but in psychology and the control of masses. One shouldn't imagine some global conspiracy where every historian secretly swears an oath to lie. The system works much more subtly and effectively. It's all about the narrative, which was formed a long time ago, probably in the 19th century, in the centers of global influence at the time. The purpose of this narrative was brutally simple and cynical: to instill in certain peoples, particularly the Russians, a complex of historical inferiority. A people that believes its ancestors were wild and backward, that they received their statehood, faith, and culture from the outside, becomes psychologically vulnerable. They are easier to control, easier to impose foreign values and interests upon. This narrative has not disappeared. It has become firmly woven into the very fabric of academic science, becoming its unspoken foundation. Now put yourself in the shoes of a modern academic historian. He has a family, children, a mortgage. His job is, first and foremost, a way to earn a salary and feed his loved ones. He has two paths before him. The first is safe and predictable. He can write his 1000th dissertation on the Tatar-Mongol yoke, the route from the Varangians to the Greeks, or the life of peasants in the 19th century. He will quote approved authorities, repeat accepted dogmas, and not ask inconvenient questions. For this, he will receive an academic degree, a stable salary, perhaps a bonus or a promotion. He will work peacefully until retirement, without creating problems for himself. The second path is to go against the system. He could start investigating the inconvenient facts: strange coins, inexplicable maps, Traces of catastrophes. He could write a paper proving that the official chronology is wrong and that an advanced civilization existed in Siberia. And what then? His work would most likely not be accepted by any scientific journal. His colleagues would call him a pseudoscientist and a fantasist. He would be stripped of grants, barred from teaching, and ultimately simply fired. And where would a historian with his education go to work at 45? This fear of losing everything you have is the system's most reliable guardian. Added to this is the mentality ingrained in the subconscious. Initiative is punishable. It's better not to stick your neck out, to do as you're told, and to go with the flow. As a result, we have what we have. History, instead of being a living, evolving science that eagerly absorbs new data and revises old theories, has fossilized. It has turned into a rigid dogma, a religion with its own canon that cannot be questioned. Any artifact that doesn't fit is declared a forgery, an anomaly, or is simply ignored. This is especially true for lands that for a long time maintained their Vedic culture and did not accept Christianity. Since the official history of Russia is largely the history of the Church, these territories, like Siberia, simply ended up with no coherent, documented history. The void was filled with the myth of savagery. Therefore, the official version of the past is not the result of objective scientific inquiry, but a carefully guarded construct that benefits certain forces. But truth has an amazing quality. Sooner or later, it finds its way to the surface. The facts presented here, from a single coin with a wrong date to a taiga gridded for thousands of kilometers, from inexplicable mints to traces of global catastrophes, all come together into a single, logical, and consistent picture. This picture proves that the official version of the past is not just flawed, it cannot withstand any criticism. History is not a static archive, but a battlefield, and today we are witnessing how the true, majestic, and tragic face of our past is beginning to emerge from under centuries of lies. The real history of our people and of all human civilization is still waiting for its explorers.